Rob, everybody.
All right, thank you. Yes, my name's Rob. I get to be one of the pastors here at Epiphany, and today we're in Matthew chapter 12. It's Memorial Weekend. I want to tell you my favorite story about America, and it's about George Washington. It was back before he was the first president of the United States, and he was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the war between the 13 colonies and Great Britain, fighting for revolution and for independence. And the war was approaching the end, and it was pretty clear the colonies were going to win their freedom. And King George III over in Great Britain asked his painter, Benjamin West, he said, "What's George Washington going to do after the war's over?" And then Benjamin West allegedly told him that Washington intends to give up his military power after the war and then return home to his farm. And King Charles said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Even after the conquering the victory, the hardest part would be to give up that power and to give up that authority that he had. Most military leaders would have felt that they deserved and they should stay in power for the good of the country. I got to see this thing through, see this thing we started. But George Washington did just that. After the war was over, he handed the keys to the military and to Congress, over to Congress, and let the country get off on its foot that way. And so it's incredible, these stories of people who give up power for some greater good. And then more often than not, we have stories of people who desperately cling to power until they are forced out. And that's more the story we're looking at today. So we've been going through the book of Matthew in this Messiah series, and the last 2 weeks have been on chapter 11. In chapter 11, there's a lot of doubts starting to rise against Jesus, doubts and accusations. And John the Baptist sends his disciples, and he's questioning. The crowds are questioning even after they see the miracles, like, is this the guy or not? And last week, Jesus denounced the cities because they were seeing all these signs and they still weren't pulling the trigger of belief. And now today we're going to see the Pharisees. And the Pharisees have been showing up throughout the story, coming with their accusations and their doubts. So let's take a look. We're in Matthew 12, verse 1. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. But some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, "Look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." And this is our Pharisees. This is pretty common for them. They show up in the story, they wag their bony fingers, and they say, "You're not doing it right." And we read it over and over. And if you're familiar with the Bible, you've seen this story before. And just the word Pharisee is kind of insulting at this point. When I read my kids in their storybook Bibles, the Pharisees always look like this. They're very crusty, crunchy, cranky old men with very punchable faces. And they're always waving their fingers, they're plotting, they're conniving, and there's something dark underneath. And for kids, it's simple. They're the bad guys. And then you see Jesus and his followers, and they're all bubbly and open, pure-eyed, and so they're the good guys, and the story builds. But when we do that, when we caricaturize the Pharisees, we can't learn from them. So today we're going to dig a little deeper into what brought it to this point where they seem so one-sided and one-dimensional, and do we have any of that in us? Because the Pharisees, they knew the law and were responsible for it more than most other people, so they really should have been the very first ones to recognize Jesus, which makes their accusations all the more hurtful. So they come to Jesus and they say, "Your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain." And this would be a huge deal. If this were true, if Jesus did break the law, I mean, we forget to think about the consequences. That would mean he's a sinner. That would mean he couldn't be our Savior. And that would mean the rest of the book from this point forward, we wouldn't even have to bother reading. Like, he's just another guy and he broke the law. And so the Pharisees said that. So what was their grounds? And it was based on this Sabbath law. And so here's what God's written law said about the Sabbath. It was in Leviticus. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of complete rest, an official day for holy assembly. It is the Lord's Sabbath day, and it must be observed wherever you live. So when God gave the law to Moses, and this is the Sabbath law, and it's very simple. No ordinary work, and keep it holy and set apart. And so why were the Pharisees saying that the disciples were breaking it? And so I just want to take a few minutes and do a history lesson on how the law developed. And so the law started back in around 1400 BC is when God gave the law to Moses. And the law had two main points to it. There's two reasons that God wanted to go about it this way. And it was that if you obey my law, I'll bless you. And that way, two things will happen. The whole world will know that I'm the one true God, and they'll know that you're my people. Also, if you disobey the law, I'll curse you. There'll be judgment. And that way, two things will happen. That way, the whole world will know that I'm the one true God.